Sometimes I feel like it could be really tough to evaluate Alabama defensive players, specifically on the front seven, and most specifically the defensive line, because of the way they rotate defenders in and out. These guys tend to stay very fresh. They don't have an incredibly high utilization rate, but they also play in a defense that has a lot of talent around them. So it can be really hard sometimes to disseminate, are the dudes really that talented, or do they benefit in part based off of the coaching that they play under, the system and scheme that they play in, and the talent that they play with and around? It can be hard. Like, sometimes to me it can be very obvious with a guy like a Jonathan Allen. It's just like, it doesn't matter what system he's in. You know he's the alpha dog. You know he's a stud. You knew he was the best defensive lineman on that team as a junior, even when that defense had a Sean Robinson and Daron Reed. Like, you knew Jonathan Allen was special. But was a Tim Williams special, talking about the edge rusher? Was an Ashawn Robinson, a Daron Reed, were they special talents, or were they guys that benefited? Were they more role players for the NFL? And it all remains to be determined, but I feel like it's really hard to evaluate these guys. So Daron Payne, talking about another defensive lineman from Alabama. It seems like this program just cranks him out. It's interesting because he didn't quite have the same level of defensive line talent around him as some of these other guys have had in previous years, but he still had Deshaun Hand on that defensive line, so there's still talent there. Rashaan Evans and the linebacking core, and then you talk about the secondary that's pretty much all going to be drafted, talking about Minkah Fitzpatrick and Anthony Averett, and talking about Tony Brown and probably Levi Wallace as well. Like, I mean, a whole secondary is getting drafted to the NFL. So the Daron Payne is kind of tough. And also I feel like it's tough because with a guy like Payne, he plays in a system that isn't necessarily designed for him to put out outstanding production. He plays a role, he fills a role. It might not even be necessarily the role that he best is suited for at the NFL level. Like, the way it felt like Alabama used him was more as their run stuffer, kind of like a run-stopping specialist. And if you got something out of him as a pass rusher, it was an added bonus. But he was there first and foremost to play the run, which was kind of by design. Whereas you look at him at the NFL, I mean, are you really going to utilize him as a nose tackle at 311 pounds, or even a 4-3 base defensive tackle where he's the primary run stuffer at 311 pounds? I don't know. And sometimes it can be frustrating when I see guys that are utilized in systems that don't get the best out of them. Like, I thought that a couple of years ago with Leonard Floyd, when they're kind of bouncing him all around. It helped him on the one hand for the NFL, but it kind of hurt him because he wasn't as far advanced as he should have been as an edge rusher, which is what the Bears drafted him for. And to me, that was his best position, was as an edge rusher. So you would think you would want to get the most out of those guys, and that, as a result, would be the best for your defense and for your team. But what do I know? But anyways, looking at Payne, I like him quite a bit. I feel like he's going to be a guy where there's some variance. Like, some people will look past the lack of pass rush production in terms of sacks and total pressures, and they'll see a guy with upside. They'll see a guy with translatable traits to the NFL and feel like his best football is ahead of him. Then you're going to have other people that look at him and say, well, maybe Alabama used him as a role player because that's primarily what he is, and he's more of a second, even third round type of talent than a guy that you'd take at the end of round one or potentially in the top 20. And I get all of those perspectives. When I look at Payne, I see a guy, he's not the biggest guy, but obviously he's big enough to hold up inside. I do feel like he's got some scheme versatility, though. I feel like he can be both a 3 technique and a 4-3 and play as a 5 technique and a 3-4, and even in those type of situations in sub packages, you can line him up inside as kind of like your nose as a pass rusher. So he provides you some nice scheme versatility that you want out of your defensive lineman. He's got pretty good initial burst and explosiveness off of the ball. He's not quite at the level of, let's say, a Maurice Hurst or a Taven Bryan, but he's got some get-up-and-go juice from the get-go, getting off the snap, getting off the line, and trying to get into the backfield. He's a strong dude. Granted, he didn't put up 41 reps at the combine like Vita Vea did, but 27's not a bad number. But I feel like he plays like a guy that put up 30-plus reps. He shows upper body strength to where he can at times be physically imposing and physically overpowering himself, which manifests more so as a run defender. He's a pretty good run defender. I could see why Alabama used him as an interior run stuffer, because that's where he's best at right now. He's very good with that burst and quickness, his ability to kind of maneuver and contort his body a little bit, to be able to shoot the gap, get skinny, get into space. He can slide off blocks while engaged and still make the stop. He's got the athleticism where he's got some range to him. You could have him chasing down the line. He can make some plays in pursuit. Plays with adequate to above adequate leverage. He will use his length pretty well. He can get blockers on their heels a little bit and off guard with his initial punch. The one thing I would say he needs to work on a little bit with his leverage and his pad level is he does have a tendency to fire out of his stance too high. And that kind of concerns me, because once you get up too high, as much as it's about size and it's about strength, leverage is so damn important. You can have small guys get tremendous leverage and they play like they're 6'5", 350 pounds. But when you increase the size of your target and you get your center of gravity too far back, you can be thrown all over the place. He's good at using his length and his hand punch to get off of blocks. And like I said before, in terms of shedding blocks, he's a guy that has that initial quickness to be able to fire off the snap and shoot the gap and get skinny and be able to shoot the gap as well. Plays with a decent motor. I think what it comes down to a lot with Daron Payne, you know he's at least going to be somebody that could come into the league and play against the run. What will ultimately determine whether or not he's a big-time player or he's a real difference maker on your defense is, can he get to the quarterback? I feel like his low sack numbers don't tell the whole story. He's got a great initial hand punch. He's got a very good counter move. He's got that explosive first step to get by blockers. Part of, I think, the lack of sacks comes into he lacks that kind of high-end second gear for an interior defender to finish. And sometimes he can get there, but he doesn't necessarily have enough flexibility, enough agility, short area, second burst to be able to get the quarterback down, similar to what I talked about with Robert Nkemdiche a couple years back. He always got in the backfield and missed a ton of plays. It's great if you could generate a ton of pressure, but at some point in time you got to be able to seal the deal, because otherwise you're just flying up the field and teams will go right where you were. I look at him, though, and I feel like he's a guy whose football is going to get better as he goes forward, meaning his best football still is ahead of him. And I happen to like him as an overall player in terms of the entirety of the package better than I do a Maurice Hurst and a Taven Bryan as an interior lineman. I've got, as you look at the grading, I've got like a borderline first, second round grade on him. But when I put together my final draft board, he probably will end up in my top 20 to 25 players and end up with an actual true first round grade on him. I feel like his best football is ahead of him. I feel like he's got quite a bit of upside. And I don't want to get too stuck on the low sack numbers, because I feel like those could be a little bit misleading based off of the role he had and what had you. This is a good dude. I don't think he's the level of prospect of Vita Vea, but if you're looking for interior line help towards the end of the first round, I would personally rather have Payne than I would Bryan or Hurst.